Welcome to Migration 2020. To kick things off is a great friend of Redbird's, Chairman of Hartzell Propeller, Joe Brown.
Hey, all you. This is Joe Brown. I'm a private pilot. Love aviation, probably like you all do since you're on this. I work for Hartzell Propeller and other general aviation companies. I've spent about 30 years in and around general aviation. And my friend Charlie Gregoire asked me if I would give a presentation on something. And I don't feel particularly qualified to tell anybody anything about flying. I consider myself more a student. But I told him that I'd heard a lot of cool tips and tricks over the years from pros that have stuck with me. And maybe it would be interesting to pass those along. So the title of this is Everyday Proficiency, things handed down from the pros. And I'm really a pass-through person for those things I've heard from others. The context for this, as I mentioned, is I got 30 years in the business. I'm a private pilot, IFR rated guy. I do fly a lot, about 400 to 500 hours a year. I think I'll clock 5,000 hours in the next couple months. I know that because it's sort of been a long-term milestone. Like a lot of you, I was pretty excited at 1,000 hours. I'm, God willing, going to be pretty excited at 5,000 hours. I do fly a turbine airplane quite a bit, and I also have a Skywagon and a Glass Air Sportsman. I'm very interested in tail draggers. But one thing that's different in my experience from a lot of folks is I've had a lot of dual training, like an embarrassing amount. Sorry about that, about 400 hours. And that's because I have had the privilege of being associated with the Hartzell Flight Department, flying both my own airplanes and Hartzell's airplanes, but generally being a low time guy from the start of my piloting journey. They had really substantial requirements for me to take training in order to be part of the corporate fleet insurance program. And what that's meant is that I got 200 hours dual to get a Cirrus SR22 and then 200 hours dual to transition to a TBM. And of course, the benefit of that is I had a lot of time to hear from pros who were on all my working flights. And it's really been one of the best things that ever happened to me. So I would say I generally operate in a pro pilot environment. And I have a lot of industry friends who are extremely capable, if not professional pilots that I go to. I was just going to give you a sense of the good fortune I have in mentors. The pro pilots at Hartzell are former airline guys and Part 135 guys, and they are exceptional. And they're really a strong crew of mentors to me. I have the privilege of knowing Sean Tucker and Mike Goulian pretty well, and I talk to those guys about flying. There's a couple airline guys, Lee Smith and John Carroll, JC Carroll. John's also a military pilot. Incredible mentors to me, tough trainers, high standards. John McKenna is a great friend of mine at the RAF. Steve Taylor is the retired chief pilot at Boeing. Man, I've beaten him up a lot on questions about flying airplanes, and he's been a wealth of insight and knowledge to me. And then these guys that I know from industry, they're also great friends of mine. Pete Bunce, who runs General Aviation Manufacturers Association, Eric Henson, who runs Simcom, and Nicholas Chabert, who runs Dyer. And the reason why I mention this is I have had many conversations with these guys. I've called them with questions, and everything you're going to see after this came from one of these guys, and it's stuck with me. So to be clear, I'm not a pro pilot. The thing that happens with me is I fly with better pilots often, which I have to say is pretty intimidating. And when I do that, I learn things, and I'm passing on those things to you. This is not a course or a seminar. Like literally, I'm not capable of or qualified to teach a course or a seminar. I put this in the category of hangar talk, but because of that, it's a little bit random. It's things I picked up here and there, and I hope you find them interesting. So with that, we'll move forward. Okay, probably one of the big categories that's changed for me over time is this notion of precision in the runway environment. And I've gotten better, and I know that I had started from a place with less precision in my basic expectation. And flying with strong guys and flying for a longer period of time has really changed my perspective on this. So as simple as it sounds, I want to just start with this idea that at takeoff and taxi, taxi and takeoff, I should say. What does it take to have your nose exactly on the center line? If that was mandatory, how well would you do taxiing exactly on the center line of the taxiways and taking off exactly on the center line of the runway? And if you're around airports here in the next few weeks or so, watch a Part 135 or airline guy taxi. Most of the time, you're going to see that center line right on the nose wheel. And then watch some GA guys taxi. And you may or may not see this, but I kind of see a plus or minus 4 to 5 to 6 feet. And they don't have the same expectations. They're not as aware and as hard on themselves as a pro pilot about having the airplane be where it's supposed to be. So even this simple thing, taxiing on the center line, has big effects over time. Now, one question that I didn't know the answer to early on is, how do you know the center line is running right underneath your nose wheel? And the answer is, if it's running through your right knee, you're centered. I know that because I flew with this awesome guy into a narrow strip, and he said, "Hey, you're always left." I said, "I'm not, I'm dead center." He said, "No, put the center line through your right knee." Everybody's heard that before, but it didn't lock in. And lo and behold, it worked. So do the same thing when you're taxiing. This is going to build basic sight memory and muscle memory. Now, when you get to the takeoff point and you've lined up on center line, and you're super aware of this for your next few flights, you're going to find that it's stinking hard to be exactly on the center line during takeoff. You're going to introduce a big power change. You're going to P factor. You're going to actually have some runway imperfections and some crowning, want to move that nose wheel off the line. You're going to have changes in rudder authority as the speed builds, and you're going to have the effects of crosswinds or gusts. It's hard. And so what you're going to start to feel that you have to do is maybe make more adjustments, little ones, constant ones, than you're used to. I can only remember that I used to throw the power in and let it run. And if it was stable, that was good enough. To stay on the center line, I have to work a lot harder. Well, what's the benefit of this? I call it a drill, because you can do it every single flight. Well, the big concept is aim small, miss small. If you aim small, you'll miss small. And tracking the center line means that when you start facing tougher crosswinds, or you face the crosswinds you're normally accustomed to, or you transition to a higher horsepower aircraft, or you get into a tail dragger, or you have those very brief IFR to VFR transitions on a low approach, your whole concept is going to be, my airplane's on center line. It's where I want it to be. And you're going to dial yourself into a higher standard of performance. I want to talk a little bit about descending down final. You know, I think a lot of people do this, but I'm just going to say it. There are power settings you should have pretty much at hand to get the airplane to perform the way you want it to perform in different phases of flight. I have a power setting for my IFR vector to final. I have a power setting for the final approach fix descending. If it's VFR, I have a power setting for downwind. I have a power setting for the perch onto base. I think a lot of you have that, but basically, if you're descending, you ought to be going to a power setting that you know is pretty close, and then tweak it. And I'm going to confess this. It took me a long time to figure out that as you're arriving in the runway environment, if you know you're going to have a honking headwind, you're going to need more power for strong headwind and lesser ground speed approaches, whether it's VFR or IFR. So, you know, usually for me, if it's manifold pressure, I'm going to add 1 inch. If it's torque in a turbine aircraft, I'm going to add 5%. But you're going to need that. One day I was flying into Teterboro with the pro pilot, the chief pilot at the time, Larry Zetterlund. And I was on a ILS, and I got a big uplift on the right wing, and the airplane kind of wallowed up, floated a little bit. I had to correct it back down. And he didn't say anything about it. And I just figured, hey, you know, it's a windy, gusty day. That's what happens when you're flying in those conditions. And I went flying with him 2 or 3 more times where I was in the right seat. And I noticed that no matter what the conditions were, when we were running down final, the airplane never seemed to move much. And I said to him, hey, remember that time in Teterboro where I was kind of wallowing around down final? And he said, yeah, I do, as a matter of fact. I said, well, what are you doing that I'm not doing? And he said, I just don't let it get very far before I take it out. So if the wing's coming up, I put it back down. And he said, you got to chop it out. Quick, sharp countermeasures, chop it out. And I started thinking about that and I started doing it. It makes an enormous difference because what happens is if you're sensitive to the idea that the airplane is not supposed to go where you don't want it to go, you will let less actual error into that condition, which will turn into less compounding error. Because, if the wing comes up, then you got to recorrect. You might have to make a little power change. So I noticed he was stable as a rail because he made these quick, sharp countermeasures. And the words he gave to me was, chop it out, quick, sharp. So in simple terms, on the descent, really any time, but especially on the descent, the airplane should not go where you didn't tell it to go. And if it wants to, don't let it. Have that in mind. I think you'll find you're going to perceive more quickly you should be making small changes. Let's talk about landing. Precision in the runway environment landing. I love this. This came from Lee Smith. He's a pro pilot for United, a backcountry guy, flies a 185. And what he told me is, you should have a touchdown target, not an aim point. You should have a place where your wheels are going to hit. And that should be coupled with landing on center line, dead straight. So touchdown target, center line, dead straight. Easy to say. It's pretty hard to do. So I asked him, well, what do you want me to do? I'll just start working on that. He said, at bigger airports, use the 1,000-foot marker as a touchdown reference. And he said, try to land in the last 10 feet. He was being very deliberate. Don't pass the 1,000-foot marker without your wheels hitting it because you're shooting for the end of that. If you're at a smaller airport, you might use the numbers. You might use a taxiway. At my home field, I actually use a landing light. That's my reference point. And what's hard about this is actually kind of fascinating to me when I began to see what was happening. Just like in ILS, as you move down the Logan slope, the sensitivity gets finer and finer and finer. Well, the same thing's happening to your visual flying. When you're at 1,000 feet above the field on a 5-mile final or something like that, space is massive. You're pointed at the airport and that's good enough. But as you work your way down, you're not pointing at the airport anymore. You're flying the airplane to a spot with a narrow stripe and you want to hit it dead on. And your frame of reference has to keep catching up with your proximity to that point. And if you wait too long to sort of dial in the fact you got to make little adjustments to stay exactly where you want to be, then you have to make big adjustments. So again, this is all around put the airplane where you want it to go and keep it going there all the way down. And as you get lower, the frame of reference gets less forgiving. One of the things I remember about my own flying that I work to avoid now is that, when you're flying downhill, you get to about 50 feet or something, you're starting to get that beautiful picture of the runway where it's kind of wide in your periphery and gets narrow. And you're probably going to hit that thing. It's looking pretty fat at that point. I don't know, pick your number. Maybe it's 20 feet. And at that point, I used to pretty much just say, okay, now I'm just going to pull the power back, hold it off and land. I wasn't doing much other active flying than that. But if you want to hit that touchdown point exactly where you intended from the beginning on the center line, dead straight, you're not going to be able to check out at 50 feet. You're going to be flying the airplane right to the asphalt. And that's the beauty of this drill. And that's what I call it. This is a drill. And I do it pretty much every flight. How hard is it? Well, it's hard. It's harder than you think. And at least for me, I'm not as good at it as I want to be. So I sort of would suggest you grade your next 10 landings. Then the only way you can get an A is that the wheels hit the last third of the 1,000-foot marker from a stabilized approach, meaning your speed's good and you've been making little small corrections to stay where you need to be. The center line is running right through your right leg, plus or minus maybe a foot. Lee would not accept that, but I'm throwing it out there. And you need to be dead straight. And you get an A with a crosswind, that's a bonus. That's a really beautiful piece of airmanship, in my opinion. I'm not sure what you're going to find, but what I found is this is harder than it sounds, and it's made me a better pilot, insisting upon this in every attempt at a perfect landing. Even if I don't get it, I have reduced my margin of error, and I'm aiming small and missing smaller. And the benefit of this is that you just build muscle memory. And this really translates into gusty conditions, IFR to VFR transitions in the tail dragger. That's what all this is about. I'll sum this up at the end. It's as simple as it sounds. Crosswinds. There's this guy named Taylor Albrecht. He does crosswind seminars. He's a neat guy. And he gave me kind of one of those golden nuggets. 30 degrees is half. If the crosswind is a 30-degree vector or less from your runway, you can treat it as half. If it's 60 degrees or greater, it's all. Obviously, in between there is something more than half and something less than all. But it's a wonderful gouge because, when I'm flying and I'm going into an airport and I understand the crosswind from the METAR, if it's greater than 60 degrees, I'm saying that's the whole enchilada. That's what I'm going to have to handle. If it's less than 30, if it's 30 degrees or less off the runway, I'm saying, all right, whatever it is, I'm cutting it in half. It's a pretty big deal because, if it's 18 gusting 28 at 60 degrees, that's a real handful. I mean, you obviously know that intellectually, but you start to prepare for that mentally with this little gouge. But on the other hand, if it's 18 gusting at 28 at 20 degrees, you go, well, geez, that's 9 miles an hour base. I can do that. 9 to 14, I can do that. And it just gives you a little bit of insight as to what you're going to experience. The other thing I got is to record your personal demonstrated crosswind takeoff and landing. I literally write this down in my logbook and I highlight it. So, for example, in one airplane I fly a lot, it's moved up, but my top highlight I think is 20 gusting 32 or 23 gusting 35 or something like that. And that's a landing that I made and gave myself, I don't know, B plus, A minus. It was a pretty nice landing and it was a handful, but I had it. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I had bolted on that same landing once before when a pro pilot came in behind me and made a beautiful landing. You wouldn't really even know it was windy out. And I talked to him afterwards and I said, I didn't think I could make that landing when I got down close. It was more than I could handle. So I went to find a different runway. What's your trick? And he gave me some pointers and some things to think about. And I put those into my awareness and I improved my flying. And it's not that I'm trying to prove that I can handle that crosswind, but when you fly IFR especially, you're going to get some pretty big crosswinds. And it's good to have a mental picture of what you've done. And therefore, you don't go try something you haven't done without that in your mind. I kind of think winds are like golf. You should plan for the shot. And for me, I say out loud what's coming. Somewhere in the pattern or the approach, I say something like wind is 20 from the left. I literally make my mind see that vector. It's going to feel like 10 knots. I'm going to use left aileron and right rudder. And I actually take my hands and I roll in left aileron and I take my foot and I push right rudder. It's like a practice swing. And for me, that just makes me feel like, all right, I know what's coming. My body knows what's coming. That's how I'm going to make the center line dead straight. And that's the scorecard. I don't always do it, but I'm always trying to do that. And that to me is everyday proficiency. Okay, new category, checklist. This was really interesting to me. The industry buries pilots with ever greater checklists because they just don't want the risk of not warning a pilot all the things they ought to check in order to have a safe flight. But, one could argue that that's a lot of information to process. So I was talking to the chief pilot of Boeing one time, Steve Taylor, who I mentioned, and I said, how does Boeing see this? How do you see this? And he said, well, people talk about flow checklist and then check done when you pull the paper out. And the flow checklist is a big feature. But he said, it's really things that can kill you or ruin your day. And my dad, also a wonderful mentor, used to use that phrase, the checklist should be things that can kill you. Steve said, more is not better, it's worse. And I don't want to misquote him, but basically I got the impression that the 787 pre-takeoff checklist item was one or two things. Now, there's big written checklists, but the verbal flow, pilot ready to go checklist was just a few things. I'm sure a lot of you do this. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this, but say them out loud. Say those crucial few things in your flow out loud. So, for example, at the runway, mine's trims, flaps, knobs, bleed to go. I say it every time. And I don't just say it, I touch things. Trims, flaps, knobs, bleed to go. And on the roll, I say out loud, oil and fuel normal. And I touch the gauge in a quick glance, bleed on. On climbs and descents, because I saw pro pilots do this, maybe you do this, it's always one to go before altitude. Oh, you're calling it out, one to go. At 500 feet, which is a specific checklist moment for me, it's gear, flaps, prop forward, yaw damp to go. And the point here is you don't need to hear me read my checklist, but hopefully you get the sense that these are oft recited things because it's easy for me to say them and they sound like I say them before. I would encourage you, if you don't do this, to sort of get those things in your mind. And I can tell you it's saved my bacon. I was doing touch and goes one day and got distracted by a caution panel situation. And I made the turn onto base and I made the turn onto final without the gear down, totally busting the perch point where I would be dropping that gear normally. And I have to say, I'm not proud of this story, but while the airplane's flying base to final, I'm looking to pick up the runway and do the things you're supposed to do. I kept thinking, man, this thing is hot. It's flying fast because my power setting that I know works wasn't getting me my airspeed. And, I just didn't go immediately to, hey, buddy, you don't have enough drag. Something's different. But when I got to that 500-foot checklist, I say, here it is, gear, flaps, prop forward. I'd look at gear, freaking knob's not down. Boom. Now, that's a terrible example of being not proficient, but it's a great example how a simple verbal checklist can prevent your day from being ruined. And that really reinforced to me that this is a great thing to build into your flying. IFR airmanship. This is another case where the things that I have really, really taken to heart really don't go with the typical advice you hear in industry these days. There's a big push to get pilots to use their automation, to get pilots to take advantage of the autopilot. Even the pro pilots will tell you that their training has strict requirements about when to use autopilot, and it's fairly often. And the best pilots I know will say, hey, the autopilot's a better pilot than I am. Why would I not let it fly? But I was trained by a chief pilot at Hartzell Propeller, and he had a very different view of this. And I found out later that he sort of reflects a school of thought that American Airlines tried to address back in the 90s, which they called automation dependency. And so an airline believed that they were creating a culture of pilots who were becoming more and more dependent on automation. And they actually have this video. You can find it out there. Maybe you've already seen it on YouTube or Vimeo. It's called Children of the Magenta Line. And they did this training program for their own pilots. Okay, so in our flight department, under the chief pilot who retired a few years ago, we have new pilots. Jake and Sean are absolutely fantastic. So back-to-back home runs. But what Larry Zetterlin, our retired chief pilot, taught me is you should hand fly every climb, every descent, and every approach. And the autopilot is for cruise. And so there's a lot of time on autopilot. Cruises are the biggest part of the flight. But, to this day, I climb out hand flying, my descents are hand flown, and my approaches are hand flown. In these instances, if you're an IFR pilot, I always use Flight Director. That's my default. It's an incredible tool. And you can be very precise, even hand flying. And if you're using Flight Director, it means if you ever do go coupled, the only thing you're doing is pressing one button. The rest of the sight picture is the same. I try to shoot easier approaches on raw data, several times a season, because if Flight Director doesn't work or it's not doing what I want it to do, I just dumb it down and get right to that raw data. That's part of the lessons of the American Airlines Children of the Magenta Line. If something doesn't look right, drop down the level in technology. So I try to be used to the idea of going from Flight Director to raw data. And, I try to make climbs and cruise and descent on standby instruments every month or so. it's kind of an incredible thing to be sitting up there and descend on raw data when you've been so used to looking at flight director. But someday you're going to have a systems failure and you're going to need that backup device. And it shouldn't be, I guess, in my opinion, the first time you've ever tried to do it. It is a little disconcerting. I do the same thing in revision mode. Sometimes I put the PFD on the MFD on the G1000 setup and try to fly from the middle screen. And it takes a little while to get used to it, especially if you're doing it by hand. Anyways, there's some real benefits to this, standard operating procedure of flying by hand. I think the biggest one is it keeps you from thinking you're better than you are. There have been a number of accidents where a pilot was counting on or dependent on the autopilot to do the flight that they themselves could not do. And I can cite you a few interesting ones. One was a Cirrus out of Cuyahoga County going to Buffalo. And that day of flying, first this person flew from Buffalo to Cuyahoga County in Cleveland, and then flew back. And on the outbound leg from Cuyahoga County, he crashed, killed himself and a passenger. But it was quite clear that there was an automation dependency in this scenario, and that this pilot could not fly by hand, but was in conditions that were way harder than he could fly in. And he got confused by autopilot needs, i.e. he didn't operate it very well. So, I mean, that's an extreme condition, but I can point to a number of accidents where this is a real part of the problem. And then this, here I have another typo. Sorry about this, you guys. And benefit number 2 is if you have a gnawing feeling about hand flying a departure, procedure, or an approach, it's a good sign that you should adjust your minimums upward. And I've had that feeling. You don't fly IFR for maybe several months. You might be filing, but you're not in the real stuff. And if you're like, man, I don't know about hand flying down to X, I'm not that sharp, move your minimum up and fly back into your skill set. You're still going to be able to make a lot of your flights. So I don't want to sound like I'm lecturing because I'm just another pilot, but I like that gut check that says I can fly this, or that sounds a little spooky right now. Maybe I ought to move my minimum up. All right, some tricks and cool stuff. Everybody's picked up some things from time to time. These are some things I think are pretty neat. It used to be, and it still is, that I'm flying a lot in like a 185, and I'm inbound to some small airport. And with GPS now pretty much on every airplane, this isn't as necessary as it used to be. But the question is, when should I start down? I'm cooking along here at 150 knots. Things are good. When should I start down? And my rule of thumb is, and I got this from a pro pilot that I fly with, for a piston aircraft, the distance out from destination, if your airplane's fast, 180 knot type of ground speed, it's 6 times your altitude to lose. Whatever you're at to wherever you need to be for pattern altitude, 6 times that is 500 foot a minute. So, not to be dumb, but if you're at, let's just say 6,000 feet and you need to get to 2, that's 4,000 feet. That's 24 miles out. So it's six times for 180 knot ground speed, 5 times for 150, 4 times for 120 ground speed. That'll get you pretty much exactly a 500 feet per minute descent. If you like to come down at 1,000 feet a minute, then you just have, those multiples. So 3 times, 2.5 times, 2 times. Anyways, I like this because when I'm cooking in there, I make a quick mental note. Hey, 23 out, I'm going to start down. That's 500 feet a minute. Boom, I'm ready to go. I got this from a trainer at Simcom. I love this. I use this all the time. At least in my flying, I find that I have these very, very long base-like legs into airports when, they're bringing you down on an IFR flight. And the same thing happens with VFR. And they clear you for the visual, but you're maybe, 10, maybe 8 miles away, and you're pretty much pointed at the airport, and you more or less consider that a base leg. And the question is, what altitude do I want to be at when I'm intercepting final? It's going to be lower than where you'd be on downwind, but what is it? Well, the answer is pretty cool. It's 300 feet for each mile of final that you're aiming to fly, plus the field elevation. and you're going to roll out on the PAPI. So I go into Burlington, Vermont a lot. It's about 300 feet field elevation. And I try to roll out on it, let's say a 2-mile final, because when they're busy, or a 3 when they're not. Let's just say 3-mile final. So that's 1,200 feet. 3 miles times 300 is 900. It's a 300-foot field elevation. If I'm at 1,200 feet as I'm turning on the final, I'm going to be on the PAPI. It works every time, or real close. It's pretty slick. I think you're going to like that one if you haven't done it yet. On the trick safe stuff, climb on speed. Never climb on vertical speed. There's a lot of accidents from people climbing on vertical speed, especially in icing. Yeah, some just brutal accidents. And I was flying with Larry Zetterlund, the chief pilot of Hartzell, one time, and we were on a speed climb of 150 knots in ice and had the inertial separator out. So the airplane didn't have a lot of climb performance that day. And we had a long climb. And I literally watched the airplane lose all of its positive vertical speed and level off and start descending in order to hold 150 knots. Now, I didn't let it go for very long, and we called center and said, no, this is as high as we can go. We're kind of topped out. But the thing that blew my mind about that is that if I had set that at VS at the beginning of that climb, I would have flown that thing into a stall. I mean, obviously, I would hope I would intervene, but that's how some of these accidents happen. And the airplane runs out of performance, and it can't hold that VS, so it just keeps trying. If you're climbing on VS, I urge you to start climbing on airspeed, which means you may have to fly that climb by hand. Icing. Yeah, I throw this out here. It just came up the other day. I use this. Probably you guys do too, but I think it's kind of interesting. A lot of times I think to myself, if I'm in icing, I got to go up or down. What's my best way? And the way I think about it is I'm trying to get to 10 above or 10 below 0C. And so I'm looking at the temperature and I'm trying to decide if I can climb to 10 below. And how am I going to know that very quickly? Well, it goes back to the lapse rate, which is about 2 degrees per 1,000. And so, if you're at, let's say, -5 and 7,000 feet, well, you want to get another 5 degrees, which is about 2,500 feet. Can you climb to 9,500 feet in a normally aspirated airplane? Yeah, you probably can. So in that situation, I'd probably go up and try to climb into that, 10 below and hope that's enough for the icing. A lot of people just say if you change altitude a couple thousand feet, you're probably going to be pretty good. That's true. This is just another way of giving you the up or down answer to your question, which way should I go to get out of this? This one is interesting. The next one, flying into weather systems from a long way away. I was flying in, let's say, a 2-ship. I was in front and there was somebody in back because we had 2 passenger loads. So it was a 2-aircraft day. And I don't know, we were maybe 120 miles out, maybe 150, far enough that it wasn't really ready for descent time, but I was already briefed. And the guy in back called me on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and he said, you're good and briefed on your alternate, right? The guy in back happened to be a pro pilot. And I said, I'm good and briefed on our destination. He said, yeah, go ahead and brief the alternate. So I did. And I was thinking to myself, he knows something I don't know. That's a sign of him being smarter than me. What does he know? So I called him on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I said, I'm briefed. What do you know that I don't know? And he said, well, when we took off this morning, the weather on the west side of our destination, was a pretty big system. It was moving about 35 miles an hour. And I had a pretty good feeling that it was going to be close to us by the time we landed, because our flight was about 3.5 hours. So I've just been monitoring a couple airports on the weather side of our destination, and they went from VFR to IFR. And so I'm expecting low. I'm expecting ILS low, and we don't have an ILS. Okay. The point I'm making is that guy had that proficiency in his everyday flying, and I did not, because I was real binary. I'm going from here to here, and where I'm going to is still saying good. And that wasn't the right question. So that situational awareness is something that stuck with me. I've found myself being ahead of the airplane, ahead of the approach a couple times since then with that kind of mentality. I mentioned Steve Taylor. He kind of blew my mind because he's obviously exceptionally experienced pilot, but he pretty much says we only fly precision approaches. We're going to have a loc and a slope, or a GPS approach with two vectors, or we're going to find an airport that has those things. He doesn't do VOR step downs. He didn't do it in the old days. He doesn't do circle to lands. He can, but he's big time saying if you're flying IFR, you're flying into conditions where you want all the system working for you, and a loc slope condition is what you want. I'm passing that along because I've taken that to heart, and I'm much more conscious of that. Wrapping up here, mentors and engagement. I think about how lucky I am to be around people that know more than me, and I see them often enough to kind of take their sometimes unintentional teaching in bites. You can hear one thing at a time. You can't hear 50. I should have remembered that before I wrote this. But the mentor role in your flying or in my flying is the best way to get better. But I'm going to say with one condition: you have to fly with them. I know a lot of people who know more experienced pilots, but they don't have them in the right seat when they're flying left seat. And man, oh man, that's a game changer, because they're seeing you do things and you're processing information at the same time. And you're going to find they just do it better. At least I do. And then you can go to school on that, and then you'll get a little bit better. The other thing I was going to say is I really encourage everybody to do some kind of annual training at a minimum. It's not flight reviews, but it's some kind of annual training. It could be getting your tail dragger endorsement. It could be a hard IFR workout. It could be going to SimCom. It could be going to one of the Redbird affiliated flight schools. Find some way to go get a workout. And simulation flying is actually maybe one of the preferred things to do, because you can do emergency scenarios and partial panels and a bunch of things like that. Even VFR, that's good stuff. But I'm fortunate that I can put on my calendar some unique training event annually, and it's made a pretty big difference. And there's a couple guys that do tail dragger training, but they're really sticking rudder guys, and they'll make you a better pilot. So if anybody's interested in some world-class training resources, I can give you a couple names. One of them I listed at the beginning, Lee Smith. He's phenomenal. I read accident reports a lot, and it's kind of a dark art. Maybe some of you do this also, but I'm trying to say to myself, hey man, don't kid yourself. There is risk in flying, and people make bad judgments, and you're no different than anybody else. The same risks exist for you, and your judgment could also fail. And so I kind of try to sort accident reports out in my head, like egregious circumstances of bad judgment. Okay, I'm going to try to avoid those at all costs. And then more marginal, a little bit of compounding effect. Their first decision made some sense. The second one was stretching the, let's say, the risk profile. The third one stretched it more. The fourth one was really the deal breaker, but each one by itself was defensible. So I kind of look for those patterns, or try to look for those patterns where I could see myself in that flight and ask myself, do you think you could absolutely say you wouldn't make those mistakes? And it's just a way of keeping my consciousness up and maybe being clear that we can all be better pilots all the time. And good judgment is the first defense against risk. And, I'm an industry guy, but this isn't really a promotion. I'm just saying that being affiliated with AOPA and EAA and the Recreational Aviation Foundation and the Seaplane Association has been, I think, wonderful in terms of thinking about flying as a deep avocation and something that requires a professional approach. You're not going to talk to active members in those associations who don't think that flying deserves discipline. And, if you get yourself associated with those kind of people, you're going to be a better pilot. I know it's been true for me. So I'm wrapping up. I'm almost embarrassed how simple the stuff is that I've suggested as part of everyday proficiency. But as I said, it's held up for me. It's pretty basic stuff. And to sum it on up, if Lee Smith were here, he'd say, hit your touchdown point on the center line, dead straight, every flight, make that your drill. So that's a Lee Smith. I urge you to think about it. From Steve Taylor, get your flow checklist down. and short verbal checklist down and say them out loud. And if you're not doing that, that's a great opportunity to backstop your own safety. Avoid automation dependency by doing hand flying as standard operating procedure. That's a Larry Zetterlund. And that's stuck with me now for a couple decades, and very important to my sense of proficiency and currency. Obviously, the point of this presentation may be that, if you're collecting tips, maybe write them down. I mean, I literally have some pages in my knee board of tips and tricks and things people have said. And if I'm on cruise, and I'm going to be up there for 3 hours, and I might glance through them and, how to use my radar better, things like that. But collect your tips and write them down, and then tell them to others in hangar flying. You may tell somebody something that they'll use for the next 10, 20 years. You don't know. And that's the kind of thing that's happened to me. And this presentation is really essentially a way to say thank you to some of these folks. And stay engaged. Go find people who fly airplanes better than you do and have them go flying with you if they're willing. Do your annual training, figure out something to do, get a seaplane rating, go get your tail dragger. Do harder new things. Don't just train, let's go do some stalls. That's very important. And let's go do some pattern work. Get yourself into something that makes your stick and rudder skills or your situational awareness skills have to cross over to a little bit higher level. And join groups and read those accident reports. Put yourself in the pilot's shoes and ask yourself, could this be me? I think this is my last slide, and I appreciate the opportunity to pass some of these things along. I hope this was interesting to you. Unfortunately, I cannot be in the Q&A afterwards, and I've asked my friend John Carroll, who is a pro pilot, if he would be on this Zoom network or this Google network for Q&A, not because he's going to reiterate what I've said, but because he's a mentor, excellent teacher. He's done a ton of teaching in the military. And so to the extent that you guys want to talk about everyday proficiency, he's a world-class resource and an awesome guy. And it's to me, frankly, it's a privilege to substitute myself with John Carroll. So appreciate you checking in. Enjoy the migration. Redbird is a very innovative company, and this gathering, under any circumstances, is an add to the GA community and the people who make it up. It's great to have friends in aviation, and it's great to have friends at Redbird. See you guys later.